Hello and welcome to Middle East Matters. Coming up in this edition, in Turkey, Prime Minister Erdogan brushes off a corruption probe and controversy over his Twitter ban as his party flexes its muscles in local elections. Elsewhere, a guilty verdict for former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert after the graft trial that had the public on the edge of their seats. We will be heading to Egypt and reporting on the female protesters who say their treatment at the hands of the authorities is typical of the country's slide into authoritarianism. We start, however, in Turkey and relief for Prime Minister Erdogan after his AKP party emerged stronger from local elections. All this despite a slew of corruption allegations and complaints of authoritarianism against his administration after bans were introduced on Twitter and YouTube. France 5 Cat's Kyle G. Brown reports on the leader who survived to fight another day.
Sweeping the municipal elections last weekend, Turkey's ruling AK party remains entrenched, and Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan's authority undiminished after 12 years in office. Critics call him the Sultan for what they consider a growing authoritarianism.
Like other autocrats, he's saying, I'm here because I've been elected, so what I want to happen in Turkey is going to happen.
Observers point to the crackdown on protests which began in Taksim Square last summer as proof that Erdogan is tightening his grip on power. Last month, he tried to block access to Twitter and YouTube when several audio recordings were leaked suggesting that Erdogan and his inner circle were involved in corruption scandals. Now in his third term, however, Erdogan's mandate has coincided with a decade of prosperity.
He has seen as the person who has elevated the welfare of the country, who has greatly benefited the poor of the country and so on. So he has, in many ways, a successful track record.
And in the face of critics accusing him of corruption, Erdogan remains defiant.
We will not surrender. From tomorrow, there may be some who flee. There are some who already fled. I personally filed legal complaint for some of them. I warned that they could flee. We will enter their lair, their stronghold. They will pay for this. They will pay the price.
Erdogan will decide whether to seek a fourth term as prime minister or run for president this summer in the first direct presidential vote.
To Israel next, where former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert has been found guilty of bribery. This after a 2-year graft trial that had the public on the edge of their seats. The verdict relating to Olmert's time as mayor of Jerusalem and envelopes of cash received in order to speed up a construction project. His stint as Prime Minister was marred by a string of scandals that eventually led to him stepping down back in 2008. France 5 Cat's Olivia Salazar-Winspear reports.
After a 2-year trial that gripped the country, Ehud Olmert has been convicted by a Tel Aviv court on charges of bribery. The former Israeli Prime Minister has been found guilty of taking over 150,000 euros in bribes in the so-called Holy Land affair. Olmert was mayor of Jerusalem in 2003 when he helped to get the residential construction project off the ground, pulling strings to speed up the development. Of those 16 defendants in the case, 13 have also been convicted, many of them close allies and former colleagues of Ehud Olmert.
Today is a milestone in public life in Israel. The court said in a loud and clear voice, enough dirt and enough government corruption. The result and declaration made by the court is proof that the Israeli immune system still works.
Olmert's time as Prime Minister was marred by a string of scandals which eventually forced him to step down at the end of 2008. Israeli courts spent the following years sifting through allegations. In 2012, he was convicted of a breach of trust for granting favours to a former business partner, including lowering a tariff on oil imports to boost his friend's profits, while he was Trade and Industry Minister under Ariel Sharon. Olmert received a 1-year suspended sentence and a fine. Many saw it as getting off lightly. The recent Holy Land conviction, however, could prove to be something of a watershed moment in Israeli politics and could well spell the end of Ehud Olmert's career.
I believe that Israel will be less corrupt from now on. People will be afraid to do what Mr. Olmert and his friends did in the last 10 years or something like that.
Olmert's lawyers have said they will appeal the decision taken by the judge, although commentators believe that it will be difficult for him to avoid time behind bars. The maximum sentence for his crime in Israel is 7 years in jail.
Now, last week, authorities here in France announced they'd halted what they referred to as an imminent terrorist plot in the southern holiday town of Cannes. The main suspect, a 23-year-old French Islamist who had just returned from fighting in Syria. His profile is typical of young men who are proving an increasing source of anxiety for the security services. Antoine Mariotti and Calvin Hung take a closer look at the French jihadis.
He was an economics student and a volunteer firefighter from Grenoble. He appeared to lead an ordinary life. But in spring last year, at just 23 years old, Bilal set off to fight jihad in Syria.
Join jihad. Celebrate all that it offers, for its rewards are far greater than anything you'll gain from fasting or praying.
At first, Bilal fought in the ranks of the radical Islamist state of Iraq and the Levant. He then joined the Al-Nusra Front as part of a brigade created in December comprising almost entirely of French nationals.
The French Al-Nusra Brigade constitutes a majority of French nationals who have come together for logistical and practical reasons. That doesn't mean that it is a French brigade per se. Rather, it is a brigade that consists mainly of French people.
Bilal was killed in mid-February during a clash in Homs, according to his comrades. Intelligence services say Bilal is just one of hundreds of Frenchmen who have come to fight in Syria since the conflict began in 2011. Black, white or North African, the French jihadists don't come from the same background, but most of them grew up in the suburbs. Some don't even speak Arabic.
Brothers, come to Sham.
We are here to stay, and we will not stop until the liberation of Palestine. We will fight here in Sham, watching down on Jerusalem.
What they call the Sham region stretches from Iraq to Lebanon through Syria, an area the Islamists would like to have control over. In order to attract fighters to this region, the Islamists resorted to modern-day advertising on the internet.
The purpose of this video is to invite you brothers to discover the reality of the situation and to encourage you to leave France to make hijrah and join us here in Syria.
Their main weapon, though, is an unshakable faith, a very radical view of Islam that has managed to convince more and more Westerners to fight in Syria. Very few come out alive, and when they do manage to return to France, anti-terrorism authorities are concerned by the threat they pose.
Finally to Egypt, where Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has announced he's to run for president in elections slated for May the 26th and 27th. Opponents of the man who led the army's ouster of Islamist President Mohamed Morsi last year continue to voice their anger out on the streets. Last week, 2 people died in clashes at Cairo's prestigious Al-Azhar University. Well, among the Morsi supporters are many women who complain of being arrested and mistreated. France 24's Sonia Dridi and Catherine Stapley went to meet 2 students on either side of the country's political divide.
This area of Cairo is an Islamist stronghold. We're here to meet Gihad, an 18-year-old student from Al-Azhar University. She still bears the scars of 2 months in an Egyptian prison. Last November, she'd been protesting against the government on the campus. On the way home on the metro, a fellow passenger saw her 4-finger Rabaa badge, the symbol of resistance of ousted President Mohamed Morsi's supporters. He alerted the police, and Gihad was arrested. It was because of this sign she endured ill treatment in prison.
They tied my hands to my feet behind me. They hit me with belts, electrocuted me. They kept insulting me, kicking me with their feet.
Her leg, her arm and her jaw were broken. She claims the prison authorities forced her to sign a document saying she sustained those injuries falling out of bed. Gihad's brother believes detaining women is a deliberate tactic on the part of the authorities.
She went through a lot with this fascist regime. They are arresting girls to pressure the men not to go to the demonstrations.
Battles between security forces and students occur almost daily as campuses across Egypt have become the focal point of protest for those who oppose the current regime. And it's not only those who support the ousted President Mohamed Morsi. Ayet was part of the Tamarud campaign that launched the anti-Morsi protests that led to his ouster last year. Also a student at Al-Azhar University, she was arrested as police stormed the campus. She was taken first to a military detention camp, where female detainees were used to humiliate men.
They made the boys take off their clothes in front of us and started to beat them in front of our eyes. They want to break the boys in front of the girls and vice versa.
She then spent 50 days in the notorious Qanater women's prison. While there, a woman prison guard subjected her to an invasive vaginal search.
The prison search was like the worst form of sexual harassment. It wasn't a virginity test, but we felt that after what we were subjected to, we weren't going to be virgins anymore.
Ayet claims she's faced intimidation from the police since speaking out about her ordeal. According to women's rights activists, a lack of accountability means the number of such cases has risen since the Egyptian revolution in 2011.
They basically know that they can get away with it, and the escalation of the violence that they commit and the sexual violence keeps increasing more and more. We believe that there is a shrinking of the public space for women because of all the violations taking place.
The Egyptian government has vowed to quell the student demonstrations. But despite the risk of repression, most of the female protesters who've been arrested are still determined to make their voices heard.
And that's it for this edition of Middle East Matters. Do join us again soon.